So picture this. It's 1940. The world is on fire, but most Americans are saying, not our problem. Yet one educator, Porter Sargent, was arguing that powerful, unseen forces were basically dragging the U.S. toward the conflict. Today, we're going to unpack his really controversial take on how it all went down. Right off the bat, Sargent hits us with this idea. What we call history is really just the story told by the winners. He's saying that the official narrative we get is often carefully shaped, leaving out a whole lot of the messy truth. And for him, this was absolutely central to understanding the push to get America into World War II. This is the lens for his whole argument. So who was this guy, Porter Sargent? Well, he was a Harvard-educated publisher and a pretty sharp social critic, known for being fiercely independent. He actually made his name creating the Handbook of American Private Schools, so his whole career was built on holding institutions accountable. And in an age that he felt was just full of propaganda, Sargent's voice really stood out. He was analytical, he was tough, and he truly believed that a healthy democracy needs citizens who have the guts to question power. Okay, let's get into the meat of it. Here's the big question Sargent is asking. If most Americans wanted to stay neutral, what or who was working behind the scenes to push the country into war? He argues it all came down to three major forces. The first force, according to Sargent, was propaganda. And he didn't just see it as lies. He called it the greatest of the arts. He believed it was this invisible, incredibly powerful tool being used to steer the hearts and minds of an entire country. I think Sargent's definition here is just brilliant. For him, it's not about crude lies, it's a subtle art. It's about painting pictures in people's minds, right? You carefully frame stories to trigger a specific feeling, maybe fear, maybe anger, and you use that emotion to guide people toward the action you wanted all along. And this wasn't just happening by chance. Sargent saw it as a deliberate, step-by-step technique. You see it here. First, you carefully select which stories to tell. Then you frame them, maybe just distort them a little, to build a narrative. The whole point is to whip up emotions, to create a wave of fear or outrage so strong that a public that wants peace will start to accept the idea of war. Now, Sargent got really specific. He pointed his finger at what he saw as a very sophisticated British campaign. He claimed it involved everything from intelligence services feeding select information to the press to bankrolling anti-German speakers in the U.S. He even used this phrase, graduating the dose of hate, arguing it was slowly ramped up over time. And he claimed they used prestigious journals to quietly influence the thinkers and academics. All right, so that brings us to force number 2. Sargent argued that this whole propaganda effort wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was being fueled by a powerful mix of big money and even bigger geopolitical dreams. He brings up this absolutely audacious goal from the famous empire builder Cecil Rhodes. Now, Sargent wasn't saying this was going to happen literally, but he used it to point to what he saw as a deeper motive. He suggested that very powerful people in Britain, along with their allies on Wall Street, saw the war as a golden opportunity to pull the U.S. back into a global system led by the British. And this right here is the network that Sargent believed was pulling the strings. He's basically drawing a map connecting Wall Street giants like the House of Morgan to key players in Roosevelt's own cabinet, and then over to influential British figures. In his mind, these weren't separate worlds. They were one interconnected group with a shared agenda, getting America into the war. To back this up, Sargent points to this really striking economic fact. He basically asks, look, if 95% of the country's money is made right here at home, why on earth was our foreign policy being dominated by the 5% involved in foreign trade? For him, the influence of that tiny slice of the economy was just completely out of whack. And that leads us to the third and final force in Sargent's argument, the actions of the U.S. government itself. He focused specifically on President Franklin D. Roosevelt, drawing a sharp contrast between what the president said in public and what his administration was actually doing. So Sargent lays out this timeline, and he argues it shows a very deliberate path to war, not just a series of unfortunate events. Just look at the contrast. In early 1938, public support for staying out of the war is at its peak, but he claims the administration was already working to dismantle the Neutrality Act. He points to things like reports of unverified submarine sightings as tactics to create a sense of crisis and break down public resistance. And then you have this, probably the most famous promise of the era. Sargent presents this as the public face of the administration's policy. But he argues that, behind the curtain, the actions being taken told a completely different story. And here's where he really lays out the contrast. While the president is promising peace, Sargent says the administration is busy taking very concrete steps toward war. We're talking about giving destroyers to Britain, shipping them weapons, and setting up naval patrols that clearly favored the British side. For Sargent, this was all the proof he needed that the U.S. was neutral in name only. So you have to ask, what was the motive? Well, Sargent had a theory. He suggested that President Roosevelt, a bit like President Wilson before him, was running into huge roadblocks with his domestic agenda. Frustrated on the home front, he pivoted to foreign affairs, where a president has a lot more power to act alone. So what do we do with all this? Whether you buy Sargent's entire argument or not, his ultimate point wasn't just about 1940. It was really about the timeless duty of every citizen in a democracy. At its heart, his work is a call to action. He was pleading with people to stop just passively accepting the official story. He wanted them to start asking the hard questions. Who's really in control here? What do they really want? And maybe the most important one of all, where are my own opinions actually coming from? I just love this quote. It perfectly captures his philosophy. Sargent is basically saying, don't let your ideas turn into concrete. He championed a scientific mindset. Your understanding of the world should be like a hypothesis. It's just a temporary framework, and you should always be ready to change it when you get new information. In the end, Sargent's book is so much more than a historical critique. It's really this timeless argument for intellectual courage. It's a powerful reminder that asking tough questions, especially of powerful people, isn't being unpatriotic. It's one of your most fundamental jobs as a citizen. And that brings us right back to the beginning, with a final question that feels like it could have been written this morning. In our age of nonstop information, of competing narratives everywhere you look, Sargent's challenge is more urgent than ever. Who is writing the history that you are living through right now?